So one of the decisions that a lot of private practice owners need to make is whether or not they want to accept or insurance or be on insurance panels. And a lot of that decision depends on the demographics of your area and what you feel like your clients need. And if you do decide to go onto insurance panels or maybe just thinking about it, one of the ways to do that is to talk to the folks at Practice Solutions. They are absolutely the experts in insurance billing and credentialing, and they do all the hard work for you. They're who I use in my practice. So go check them out today, and you can find out about them by going to practicesol.com/Gordon and talk to Jeremy and his team, and they'll help you out in navigating the whole insurance piece and help you take the headaches out of it. This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, helping you to navigate your private practice journey. This is session number 76 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, folks. I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy. I hope you're having a great week so far, or weekend, whenever you might be listening to this. We just got through with the holiday weekend. I celebrated Easter, and for those of you that I'm sure you might have had some festivities going on this past weekend. It's been an interesting journey for me over the last few weeks. I know I might have shared with some of you about the struggles my wife has had with her fall. She had a weird thing happen. There was a deer. We have a lot of deer in our neighborhood, and there was a deer that got injured, and she went out to check, and the deer had laid down in our front yard. And so she went outside to check out what was going on, and called emergency personnel, and our neighbor came over, and the deer managed to hobble off. So I don't know what happened to the deer. But anyway, when she was coming back into the house, after everybody had left, she slipped and fell and broke her ankle in 3 places and had to have surgery and all kinds of stuff. So needless to say, I've been in a different mode here lately and really trying to adjust to life. And, one of the things about being in private practice, I'm able to do that. I'm able to rearrange my schedule and that sort of thing. Also, just on a personal note, dealing with my dad's illness and his failing health, and so having to take off for those things. It just, life happens. And so you have to be prepared for those things. So, but it was great. This past weekend, my daughter came in town and we did some yard work, and it was just a lot of fun to be with her. And she and I have this weird sense of humor and laugh a lot. So it kind of helps kind of heal some of the hard things of life that we all go through. So, but, anyway, I'm rambling a little bit today, and I apologize for that. But anyway, in today's episode, I'm gonna do a little bit more of a solo thing. I've got some great guests lined up, though, and I'm really excited about next week. I've got Melvin Verghese from the Selling the Couch podcast, who is going to be on my podcast on the Practice of Therapy. He was gracious enough to invite me to be on the Selling the Couch podcast, which will be, I believe he told me that episode will be coming out in a few weeks, but we talked about G Suite and just some of the tools that you can use around G Suite and the G Suite course that I've got. And so I've just been so thrilled to get to know Melvin, and he's going to be on next week. So look forward to that. That'll be episode number 77 that Melvin is on. And then also, I've got Brad Pliner, who is going to be on the podcast here next month. And Brad is the founder of Therapy Notes, and you've heard me talk about Therapy Notes here on the podcast before. They're one of our quote-unquote sponsors for the podcast, and so I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with Brad just to find out more about Therapy Notes and the what they provide. And so got lots of future episodes coming up. But in this episode, one of the things that I love getting emails from people, and people will email me and ask me questions, and I just love that. But there's been kind of a theme here lately of questions just surrounding starting a group practice, and people looking for information about that and resources about starting group practices. There's lots of great resources out there. In fact, one of the ones that I point people to is on Facebook, a Facebook group called the Group Practice Exchange that is kind of headed up by Maureen Werbach. She was in an earlier episode of this podcast, and she also has a podcast of her own, the Group Practice Exchange. But Maureen's got a great group there where people who are looking to start group practices and that sort of thing can go and get information and advice from other people that are going through the same things. And, we're really fortunate that we've got several groups like that on Facebook. I've got my community, the Practice of Therapy community on Facebook, is also a private group on Facebook. I'm trying to figure out what to do with that group, because I don't necessarily feel like I need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to support online through social media, particularly Facebook groups. So I'd love to maybe get some feedback from folks around that. If you had another private group on Facebook, what would you want it to cover and what would you want it to do? But anyway, where I'm going with this, I'm sorry I'm rambling. I've been kind of scatterbrained today. But anyway, where I was going with this is I've had a lot of questions. I've had a lot of questions from people here lately just about kind of some of the logistical things around starting group practices. So I thought I would address those today in this episode, and I'll get to that here in just a little bit. I did want to remind folks that we're still in the pre-launch phase of the Money Matters and Private Practice course, and got the majority of the content is up and available to people. And while we're still in this pre-launch phase, you can get the whole course for half price, and I'm offering that still to people. You can use the coupon code TAKE50, TAKE 50, and I believe, if I remember this correctly, if you do the payment plan, so to speak, it's only about $37 a month for 4 months to get the full course. So it's a pretty good deal right now. But part of what I'm going to be talking about today is covered in the course in more detail, in particularly what to pay people that are working for you, and some different models around that. So we'll get to that here next on the Practice of Therapy podcast. And thanks again, folks, for joining me today. Since I started the practice of therapy, it was in 2016 that I launched this platform, the blog. It originally was a blog on just private practice building and just information about the business side of private practice, particularly for therapists and mental health providers. But also there's some bleed over. I'm learning to folks that might be registered dietitians, and also maybe massage therapists or chiropractors, or really anyone that is in a helping profession where they provide services. This platform has been helpful to those people. At least that's the feedback I'm getting. But the number one post that I've got out there, and it's still by far, it has hands down more traffic than any other post on the blog, was one that I wrote about the business models of private practice. And in that blog post, I just walk people through just some different ways in which people can structure a private practice. And as a matter of fact, I did like an infographic around that, and you can download that for free if you go over to the website and just do a search for business models, and that should come up for you, and you can get the link to that. But in that blog post, what I talk about is just really kind of walk people through from doing something that is really simple around the simplest thing in terms of private practice is having a solo practice where you've got the one person that is doing what they're doing. And then just kind of going out from that, a co-op model, which would be just kind of sharing the cost of running a practice where you might have like two independent solo practitioners that are, for example, maybe renting an office together. That's one model. The other one is, and the one that I get the most questions about is starting a group practice. And when I think about starting a group practice for private practice, usually it's done when people reach kind of that, or reach some growing pains. In other words, typically what happens is their practice will be full. In other words, they've kind of maxed out the number of clients that they can see in a week. And so what they typically do is tend to start a wait list. But what they recognize too, when people get to that stage, and I know there's some of you out there that are thinking, oh my goodness, I wish I had a wait list, but keep at it. You'll get there. You can be persistent and consistent with what you're doing, and you'll get there. But once you get to a place where you've really got more clients than you can actually see, that is a point at which a person usually typically starts thinking about, well, would it be a good idea for me to start a group practice, bring on other therapists, other counselors to join me in my practice? And I would say for most people, the answer is yes. That is the point at which you'd want to do that. I know that's what I did in my own practice. I reached kind of that critical mass where there were only so many clients I could see in a week, and I was realizing that, I could add more appointment slots to my current schedule, but I really didn't want to work that much or have those many hours. And plus keep up with all the logistics of, the paperwork and all of that sort of thing. So it really makes sense when you reach that point that you'll want to bring on other people. So when you reach that point, there are really kind of two avenues you can go down. It's kind of that you reach that decision, okay, I want to bring on other people. What are the two ways that I could do that? Well, the one way that I think a lot of people start out with, and there's some that start with the other, there's two different ways to hire people. One is as a contractor. In other words, what we refer to here in the United States as a 1099 contractor. And so what that means, the 1099 just refers to a form that you give at the end of the year that's required by the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, that states how much you paid a person for a particular job. In the contractor model, you have less oversight over what that person does. In other words, you can maybe give them a parameter. Okay, this is when I want you to work, but you can't tell them how to do their job. And the way to think about it is, if you were to hire a contractor to come to your house to maybe do some things, for example, with my wife, with her broken foot, we had to make our downstairs bathroom more wheelchair accessible. And so I had to hire a contractor to come in and widen the door to our bathroom. So with that particular way of doing things, as I said, okay, this is what I want done, and this is the end I have in mind, but I didn't tell him how to do that job. And I didn't provide his tools. He provided the materials to do the job, to complete the job. All of those things were done with his oversight. I just paid him for the job that he was doing. And so when you think about using a contractor model within private practice, where you're hiring somebody to come in and see clients on your behalf, you've got very little oversight about that. The upside of it is that you don't have as much paperwork to worry about, or as much overhead costs on your side of things with that. You just write them a check for the work they do. And we'll talk here in a minute about ways that you can think about compensating people with these two different ways of doing things. The second way of doing things are with employees, where you actually hire somebody as an employee of your practice, and then you would either pay them an hourly rate for the job that they're doing, or you would pay them a salary. Those are the two different ways of doing that. So let's dig in just a little bit more here. So with compensation, obviously you want to pay people for the work they do. And there's two different ways of going about this. Typically with contractors, you would pay them per case. In other words, you would pay them pay them for each session that they hold, and then just do that over time. And that could be either a flat rate that you agree to with them, where you pay them, say, I'm just making up a figure here, $50 a session. But you would collect maybe $100 a session from the client, but you would pay the contractor $50 for having seen that person. Another way to do that is to do what is called a fee split. So this works particularly well for folks that are maybe on insurance panels where you're paying the person based on a percentage that you collect. So again, a typical fee split would be a 50-50 split, where you keep 50% of it for the practice and pay the other 50% to the contractor or to the employee in either case. One of the things you have to be aware of, though, is in different states there are laws around that, in that some states don't allow you to do a fee split. And I know for some folks, there might even be some ethics with that, in that there's some questions about that. But one of the things about either way you look at it, whether you pay them a flat rate per session, or you pay them an hourly rate for the time they're working, or you pay them a salary, you still have to cover your costs as the practice owner. You've got to be able to pay for the place for them to see clients. So it's important to kind of work through the numbers on that and really kind of understand what is going to be a good payment that's going to work, that's going to be fair for them, but also fair for you. I did mention this at the beginning, but in the Money Matters course that I've got, and you can get to that at practiceoftherapy.com/finance course. I go over this in detail about different ways to do fee splits and ways to pay people within your practice. So, sorry, I jumped around there without really talking more about an employee model. But with the employee model, you can apply the same principles as you would with a contractor in terms of payment of people. What you would need to do is check with your employment, some employment experts in your area, depending on your state and local laws around paying people. Obviously, you're going to have a minimum wage you're going to need to pay people. And obviously with us working with professionals, we're going to pay much more than the minimum wage, but you do have to make sure that you're paying at least the minimum wage, or you are paying something close to that with a salary. The other thing to consider around payment of people that become your employees, number one is that there's a thing called an exempt employee, and that's usually applied to people that are professionals. And so you've got more leeway around the minimum wage or how you pay them. Typically, an exempt employee is somebody that's a salaried employee, or they're paid their fee on a per case basis. So the difference with employees, or in other words, what we would refer to as W-2 employees, or instead as opposed to 1099s, your W-2 people, there are going to be more cost associated with having an employee. And those costs primarily are what you have to pay in terms of taxes. For employees, the employer is usually required to pay half the Medicare portion of FICA, and also half of the Social Security portion of FICA. And the FICA is just the Federal Insurance something Act. And that's that portion, if you ever worked for somebody, where they take out your Medicare and your Social Security. So if you employ people, you have to pay half of that for them. Whereas for self-employed people like me, I pay all of it myself. And so that's a little thing you need to know about when figuring your costs. The other thing that you might have to pay in addition would be unemployment insurance. The federal government does require that you pay a certain portion of that. That's usually taken out of included in the FICA. And again, in the Money Matters course, I go into more detail about this, but that's an additional cost for you. The other thing too is that some states and local you do have to sometimes pay state and local unemployment insurance as well. The other thing that you'll have to pay when you hire people as employees might be that you'll need to pay some workman compensation, have workman compensation insurance in place. So if somebody were to get injured on the job, you need to make sure that you've got you're protected under that. So again, those are things that I go into detail with in the Money Matters course on that, but that's just something to be aware of. So one of the things that you need to be thinking about if you're going to either way you go, whether you do 1099 contractors, certainly the advantage to doing a 1099 contractor is you don't have the employee costs associated with that. The downside is, as I mentioned, you don't have as much oversight with the person that you're working with. In other words, you can't tell them when to come in or how to do their job and that sort of thing. Whereas an employee, you've got much more oversight. You can dictate, when they need to work. You can also require meetings for them to come to meetings, all of those kinds of things. You really kind of chart the course for them as to how they do their job. So those are things you have to weigh for yourself. Employees do have more costs associated with them than 1099 employees. So you have to weigh those things out. But the other thing about the employees, though, it sounds like maybe on the surface, well, why would you have employees if you've got to pay all this extra stuff to have them on board? It might be that when you actually crunch your numbers, you could actually be more profitable by having employees versus contractors. And so let me explain a little bit more about that. With employees, since you're paying out more things for them and providing more things for them in terms of benefits, you can justify paying them a little bit less salary-wise, and also taking maybe a little bit larger cut if you do a fee split. And here's the reason why. With your employees, as I mentioned, you're going to be paying half of their their Medicare, half of their Social Security. Also, you're going to be having the expense of unemployment insurance, also the expense workman's compensation coverage. All of those things are things that you're providing for them in order for them to have that job. The other thing that you would be able to provide with employees, you could also have some extra benefits and perks for the employee. For example, maybe a retirement plan or health insurance. Those kinds of things would be things that you're providing that are part of their total package with their compensation. So you keep a larger portion of what they collect. Whether it's through a fee split or by paying them a flat rate per session, you actually end up giving them more in terms of benefits by having them as an employee versus a contractor. So that's something I think everybody has to weigh out for themselves. One of the things that I think I mentioned in an earlier episode of the podcast, this past year, this year in 2018, at the beginning of the year 2019, at the end of 2018, I no longer had contractors. But what I did is I switched everybody over to employees. And we had a long conversation about that with my staff before I did that. And I'm actually providing them more in terms of benefits by making them employees. As I mentioned, they're getting one of the things that some people run into as contractors is that they don't take into account the fact that they're self-employed. And so they might get into a little bit of trouble in terms of needing to not paying their self-employment taxes. So I kind of took that burden off of them by making them an employee. The other thing that I mentioned with employees, you do also have to do their federal income tax withholding as well. So there's more work on my end in terms of what I'm having to do in terms of the employees, but in the long run, it is more profitable for me to do it that way. I've got better retention of people by having them as employees. I'm also able to provide more for them in terms of benefits. So those are things you have to weigh out and just look at the total cost of that for yourself. Sometimes paying out more can make you more profit. And again, I don't have time to go into all of that in this particular episode. But again, as I mentioned, I cover a lot of this in that Money Matters course and really showing you kind of the ins and outs and the logistics and the kind of the math and the finances behind all of that. So that's what I have for today. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. Just some more information about things you have to think about when going into a group practice and how you're going to pay people. One question I will, before I finish up here, that I get asked is, how do you compensate people? How do you decide on what you're going to pay them? Well, again, I kind of hit around this a little bit earlier, but here's the thing to think about. There's several ways to do it. One is just to pay people a flat fee per case. In other words, you pay them, a certain amount per case, or you could do a percentage of what you collect. And I did that for a long time, and the state that I'm in, Tennessee, allows for that. Again, check with somebody that's an employment expert in your area as to whether or not fee splits are kosher or not in your particular area. So understanding that is important as well. So if you have more questions like these or about this, do feel free to email me at gordon@practiceoftherapy.com. Again, in this episode, I've just kind of hit the high points of this, but those were some questions that I've got asked a lot over the last several weeks, just about becoming a group practice and when to start think about transitioning to become a group practice owner. Well, folks, I hope that that's been helpful for you. I know I bounced around a little bit, and there was, but hopefully you followed my train of thought on that around starting group practices and the different ways that you can compensate your people. You know, number one, the contractor model where they're not your employee, but you have less oversight, versus the employee model where you have more oversight. And both of them, you have different ways of compensating people. You can pay them just a salary, that works well for some people, or you could pay them on a per case basis or a flat rate per case, or do a fee split where you pay them a percentage of what they collect. So those are different ways of doing that. There's no right way. And as I mentioned, I go into more detail about that in the Money Matters course that you can find at practiceoftherapy.com/finance course. One other thing I'll say here real quickly before we close, another thing that I meant to add in there is that one of the things I do in my own practice is I have kind of an incentive-based way of paying people. So in other words, I do pay them a flat rate per clinical hour, per billable hour. Let me clarify that. So if we're able to collect on a case, I pay them a flat rate per case, per clinical hour, but it's on a increasing scale. So in other words, the more clients they see within a month, the more their rate goes up. So again, I don't have a lot of time to go into the detail of that, but that is another way that you can compensate people in private practice with, and it's worked out well for me in my own practice, in that people are motivated to see more clients, and they know that they get paid more the more clients they see. And so there's that incentive built in. So, well, folks, I hope this has been a helpful session for you, a helpful episode rather. Do tune in to these future podcasts. I've got those exciting guests coming up. Also, do take a look at our sponsor for today's Practice Solutions. They're great folks, and they help me out with the insurance side of things and the billing side of things within my private practice, so I'm not having to spend my time on all those things from month to month. I know that it's handled, and it's handled professionally. And so check them out today. You can go to them at practicesol.com/Gordon and give them a try. They're great people, and I enjoy working with them and can highly recommend them. Also, if you're listening to the podcast, let's be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. Whether it be on iTunes or on Stitcher or Spotify or iHeartRadio or Google Play, wherever you might be listening to the podcast, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. It just helps boost our ratings, and also take the time to give us a rating and give us some feedback. I love that honest feedback for the podcast. And again, it just makes us more accessible to people. So take care, folks, and look forward to talking to you again in the next session or the next episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.